A judge orders a beloved dog to be put down after a tragic attack. But just when all hope seems lost, the vet does something unthinkable. He steps forward with new evidence. What happens next shocks everyone and changes the lives of this family forever. Can this dog be saved? Or will the court's decision seal her fate? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Rachel stirred the pot of spaghetti sauce, breathing in the rich aroma of tomatoes and herbs. The kitchen was warm and peaceful, filled with the gentle bubbling of boiling pasta and the soft whir of the ceiling fan. Ruby lay by the door, her brown eyes following Rachel's movements with devoted attention. The German shepherd's tail thumped softly against the linoleum floor whenever Rachel glanced her way. Through the kitchen window, Rachel could see Max playing basketball with his friends in the driveway. Their laughter and shouts drifted in, bringing a smile to her face. It was a perfect summer evening, the kind that made all her worries feel far away. "Almost done, girl," Rachel said to Ruby, who perked up her ears at the sound of her voice. "Just need to drain the pasta." After dinner, Rachel hummed as she loaded the dishwasher while Max finished his homework at the kitchen table. The phone's sharp ring cut through the quiet. Rachel wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered. "Rachel, you need to come to the park right now." Mrs. Henderson's voice was shrill with panic. "It's Ruby. She's attacked someone's dog. It's bad, really bad." Rachel's heart stopped. "What? That's impossible. Ruby's right here." But when she turned around, the spot by the door was empty. She hadn't even noticed Ruby slip out. "Max, stay here." Rachel grabbed her keys with trembling hands and ran to her car. The drive to the park took only minutes, but each second felt like an eternity. Her mind couldn't make sense of what was happening. Ruby had never shown aggression toward anyone or anything. When Rachel pulled into the parking lot, she saw the crowd first. Then she heard the crying. She pushed through the circle of onlookers and froze. A small white dog lay motionless on the grass, its owner sobbing nearby. Ruby stood to the side, trembling and confused, held back by two men who had grabbed her collar. "I don't understand," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. "She wouldn't. She's never—" The sound of sirens filled the air as animal control arrived. Ruby's ears flattened against her head, and she whimpered, looking at Rachel with frightened eyes that seemed to beg for help. The animal control officers approached with a catch-pole. "Ma'am, we need to take your dog," one of them said firmly but kindly. "There will be an investigation." Rachel watched, tears streaming down her face, as they led Ruby away to their van. Her gentle, loving Ruby, the dog who let Max use her as a pillow during movie nights, who brought Rachel her slippers every morning, had just killed another dog. Nothing made sense anymore. The park grew quiet as the crowd dispersed, leaving Rachel standing alone on the grass. The evening breeze that had felt so pleasant earlier now chilled her to the bone. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. What had happened to her sweet, gentle Ruby? How could things have gone so terribly wrong in the space of one ordinary evening? The morning sun cast long shadows across the animal shelter's parking lot as Rachel pulled in. Her eyes were puffy from a night spent crying instead of sleeping. The shelter staff led her down a stark hallway lined with kennels, the sound of barking echoing off concrete walls. "She's in here," the staff member said, pointing to a kennel at the end. Rachel's heart clenched when she saw Ruby. The German shepherd lay in the corner, her usual alert posture replaced by something unfamiliar. When Rachel called her name, Ruby lifted her head slowly, but her eyes seemed to look right through her. "Hey, sweet girl," Rachel whispered, kneeling by the chain-link door. Ruby stood up unsteadily, wobbling as she approached. There was none of her usual tail-wagging excitement, no happy whine of recognition. Instead, Ruby paced back and forth, bumping into the water bowl and spilling it. "Something's wrong," Rachel muttered. She pulled out her phone and called Dr. Avery's office, explaining the situation through tears. To her relief, he agreed to come to the shelter right away. When Dr. Avery arrived, his familiar presence brought a small measure of comfort. He'd been Ruby's vet since she was a puppy, and his calm demeanor had always put both Ruby and Rachel at ease. But today, his expression grew serious as he observed Ruby through the kennel door. "How long has she been acting this way?" he asked, making notes on his clipboard. "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "She seemed fine yesterday before everything happened." Dr. Avery entered the kennel carefully, speaking softly to Ruby. The dog continued pacing, showing no recognition of the vet she'd known for years. When he tried to examine her eyes, Ruby jerked away, nearly losing her balance. "Her pupils are dilated," Dr. Avery noted. "And look at how she's moving. There's definitely something neurological going on here." He turned to Rachel, his face etched with concern. "I'd like to run some tests. Blood work, maybe an MRI. This behavior isn't normal, and it might explain yesterday's incident." Rachel nodded, hope mixing with fear in her chest. "Do whatever you need to do." It took several hours for Dr. Avery to complete his initial examination and collect samples. By the time Rachel left the shelter, the sun was setting. She drove home in a daze, her mind replaying Dr. Avery's words about possible neurological conditions. The house felt empty without Ruby's presence. No clicking of nails on the floor, no jingling collar, no warm body pressing against her leg as she made dinner. Max was staying at his father's house. Rachel couldn't bear to tell him about Ruby yet. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at Ruby's empty water bowl in the corner. The possibility that Ruby might be sick, that her actions weren't her fault, brought both relief and terror. Relief that there might be an explanation. Terror at what that explanation might mean. As night fell, Rachel lay in bed, wide awake. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ruby's confused face at the shelter, so different from her usual loving expression. The minutes ticked by slowly as she waited for morning and news from Dr. Avery's tests. Rachel's phone rang just after sunrise. Her heart jumped when she saw Dr. Avery's name on the screen. She'd been up for hours, unable to sleep, waiting for this call. "Rachel, I have Ruby's test results," Dr. Avery said, his voice gentle but serious. "I believe she's suffering from canine cognitive dysfunction syndrome, or CCDS. It's a neurological condition that affects older dogs, similar to Alzheimer's in humans." Rachel sank into a kitchen chair, her hand trembling. "But Ruby's only 6 years old. Isn't that too young?" "While it's more common in senior dogs, early onset cases do occur," Dr. Avery explained. "The MRI showed some concerning changes in her brain structure, and her blood work supports this diagnosis." He continued, walking Rachel through the condition's details. "CCDS can cause confusion, anxiety, and changes in personality. Dogs might forget their training, become disoriented, or even show aggression because they're frightened and can't process what's happening around them." Rachel's eyes welled with tears as everything started making sense. Ruby's recent clumsiness, the way she sometimes seemed lost in familiar places, and now the tragic incident at the park. "The good news, Doctor," Avery added, "is that there are treatments available. Medication can help manage the symptoms and slow the progression. We can work with a veterinary neurologist to develop a treatment plan." After hanging up, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, processing everything she'd learned, the relief of having an explanation mixed with the heartbreak of knowing Ruby was sick. She heard Mac's footsteps coming down the stairs and took a deep breath, knowing she needed to tell him the truth. Max entered the kitchen, his usually bright face clouded with worry. "Mom? Any news about Ruby?" Rachel patted the chair next to her. "Sit down, sweetie. Dr. Avery just called with Ruby's test results." As Max settled into the chair, Rachel explained Ruby's condition in terms he could understand. "Ruby's brain is sick," she said softly. "It's making her confused and scared, and that's why she acted the way she did at the park." Max's lower lip trembled. "But Ruby would never hurt anyone on purpose. She's a good dog." "You're right," Rachel said, pulling him close. "What happened wasn't Ruby's fault. It's like when Grandpa sometimes forgets things or gets confused. Remember how the doctor said his brain was sick? Ruby has something similar." Max sat up straighter, determination replacing the sadness in his eyes. "Then we have to tell everyone. They can't put Ruby down if she's sick. She needs help." He jumped up from his chair. "I'm going to make posters and put them all over town. And I can make a video for social media explaining about Ruby's condition. People need to know the truth." Rachel watched her son's fierce dedication to saving their beloved dog, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a spark of hope. The courthouse loomed before Rachel and Max like a fortress of stone and judgment. Rachel's hands trembled as she straightened Max's tie, a gesture more for her comfort than his appearance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as they climbed them together. Inside the courtroom, the polished wooden benches felt hard and unforgiving beneath them. The prosecutor, a stern-faced woman in a crisp navy suit, presented her case with clinical precision. Your Honor, the dog in question killed another animal in a public space. The severity of this attack cannot be overlooked, regardless of the circumstances," the prosecutor stated, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. Rachel's heart sank as she watched the judge's expression grow increasingly grave. When he delivered his ruling, each word felt like a physical blow. "Given the violent nature of the incident, I hereby order the animal to be humanely euthanized within 7 days, the judge declared, his gavel striking with finality. Max grabbed Rachel's hand, his small fingers squeezing tight. She could feel him shaking with silent tears. A familiar voice cut through their shared grief. "It's the right decision, Rachel." She turned to see Greg, her ex-husband, standing in the aisle. He wore an expensive suit and a look of stern disapproval she remembered all too well from their marriage. "What are you doing here?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Protecting our son," Greg replied, moving closer. "That dog is dangerous, Rachel." "You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. What if Max had been near Ruby during her episode? What if next time—" "There won't be a next time," Max interrupted, jumping to his feet. "Ruby's sick. She needs medicine, not to be killed." Greg's face hardened. "This isn't about the dog being sick. This is about safety. Rachel, you need to think about Max's well-being for once." "Don't you dare question my parenting," Rachel shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "I am thinking about Max. I'm teaching him that we don't abandon family members when they're sick, that we fight for those we love." Rachel stood up, gathering her courage. She approached the judge's bench, her heart pounding. "Your Honor, please. We have medical evidence that Ruby's aggression was caused by a neurological condition. She needs treatment, not euthanasia. I'm begging you to reconsider." The judge looked down at her, his expression unchanged. "Mrs. Parker, while I sympathize with your situation, my decision stands. The court cannot risk another incident." Rachel felt the room spin around her. She clutched her folder of medical reports. Doctor. Avery's diagnosis, the MRI results, the treatment plans, all now seemingly worthless. As she walked toward the courtroom doors, each step felt heavier than the last. Greg's voice followed her. "Rachel, you need to accept this." But something stirred in her chest, a feeling stronger than despair. She might have lost this battle, but deep inside, she knew this wasn't the end. Ruby deserved someone who would fight for her, and Rachel wasn't done fighting yet. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows as Rachel stirred her untouched coffee. Dr. Avery sat across from her, his kind eyes filled with determination. "There's still hope, Rachel," he said, pulling out a worn notebook. "I've been making calls to specialists all morning. Dr. Christopher Hughes at the University Animal Hospital is particularly interested in Ruby's case." Rachel looked up, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her chest. "Really?" "He's one of the leading experts in canine neurological disorders," Dr. Avery explained, sliding a business card across the table. "He's willing to examine Ruby and provide expert testimony if needed." "But the judge already made his decision," Rachel said, her voice cracking. "Decisions can be appealed, especially with new medical evidence." Dr. Avery leaned forward. "We need to prove that Ruby's aggression was a direct result of her condition, and that with proper treatment, she won't be a threat." Over the next few days, Rachel immersed herself in research. Her kitchen table disappeared under stacks of medical journals and printouts about CCDS. She highlighted symptoms that match Ruby's behavior: confusion, anxiety, changes in sleep patterns. Each piece of information felt like a small victory, another step toward understanding what had happened to their beloved dog. Dr. Avery kept his promise, arranging for Dr. Hughes to examine Ruby at the shelter. Rachel's heart ached as she watched the neurologist perform various tests, noting Ruby's responses and behavior patterns. The German Shepherd's eyes seemed clearer when she recognized Rachel, but there was still confusion there, a cloudiness that hadn't been there before. That evening, Rachel sat with Max on their living room couch, surrounded by Ruby's favorite toys. Max held Ruby's worn tennis ball, running his fingers over its fuzzy surface. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think Dr. Hughes can help Ruby?" Rachel pulled her son close. "I hope so, sweetheart. Dr. Avery thinks he's our best chance." "Then we can't give up," Max declared, sitting up straighter. "Ruby wouldn't give up on us." Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes as she hugged Max tighter. "You're right. We won't give up on her. Not now. Not ever." They sat together in the growing darkness, holding on to their hope and each other, knowing that somewhere in a shelter cage, Ruby was waiting for them to bring her home. The veterinary hospital buzzed with quiet activity as Rachel led Ruby down the sterile hallway. Dr. Avery walked beside them, his presence steady and reassuring. Ruby moved cautiously, her steps uncertain, but her tail wagged slightly when she recognized familiar faces. Dr. Hughes's examination room was bright and spacious. The neurologist, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses, greeted them with a warm smile. "Hello, Ruby," he said softly, approaching slowly, to let the German Shepherd adjust to his presence. Rachel watched anxiously as Dr. Hughes conducted his examination. He tested Ruby's reflexes, checked her eye movements, and observed her responses to different stimuli. His gentle hands moved with practiced precision as he made notes on his clipboard. "Tell me about the changes you noticed before the incident, Doctor," Hughes asked, looking up from his notes. Rachel cleared her throat. She started getting confused about familiar places. Sometimes she'd stare at walls, and her sleep patterns changed completely. She'd pace at night, and during the day she seemed lost. Dr. Hughes nodded, reviewing Ruby's medical history. "And Dr. Avery noted increased anxiety in her last checkup?" "Yes," Dr. Avery confirmed. "It was subtle at first, but definitely there." The examination continued for another hour. Ruby remained cooperative, though her confusion was evident in the way she sometimes startled at ordinary sounds or lost focus during simple commands. Finally, Dr. Hughes sat down across from Rachel, his expression thoughtful. "The symptoms you've described align with canine cognitive dysfunction syndrome," he began. "But there are some aspects that make me wonder if we're dealing with something else." Rachel's heart tightened. Something else? There's a possibility of a rare condition called autoimmune encephalitis. It can cause similar symptoms, confusion, behavioral changes, aggression, but the onset is usually more sudden than typical CCDS. Rachel gripped the arms of her chair. "What does that mean for Ruby?" "We need to run more specific tests," Dr. Hughes explained. "Blood work, an MRI, and possibly a spinal tap. These will help us determine exactly what we're dealing with." Rachel felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. Each day that passed was another day closer to the court's deadline. Yet here was another hurdle, another set of tests, another waiting game. Dr. Avery, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on Rachel's shoulder. "We're getting closer to answers," he said, his voice warm and confident. "This is exactly what we need, a thorough investigation into Ruby's condition." He smiled at Rachel, his eyes reflecting the same determination she felt in her heart. "We'll keep fighting for Ruby," he promised, "every step of the way, no matter how difficult it gets." Rachel looked at Ruby, who had settled at her feet, her brown eyes gazing up with trust and confusion. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together, one step at a time. Max sat cross-legged on his bed, his laptop balanced carefully on his knees. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he typed out Ruby's story, making sure to include every detail about her condition and the unfair court ruling. He added photos of Ruby playing in their backyard, snuggling with him on the couch, and helping Rachel in the garden. "Please share Ruby's story," he wrote. "She's sick, not dangerous, and she deserves a second chance." With a deep breath, he clicked post and watched as his message went live on several social media platforms. Within minutes, the first responses started trickling in. People began sharing Ruby's story, adding their own messages of support. "This isn't fair," one comment read. "Dogs deserve medical treatment, just like humans do." Rachel peeked into Mac's room, curious about his intense focus. "What are you up to, sweetheart?" "I'm helping Ruby," Max said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Look, Mom." People are sharing her story everywhere. Rachel leaned over his shoulder, watching in amazement as the number of shares and comments grew. By evening, hundreds of people had joined their cause, using hashtags like #SaveRuby and #Justice for Ruby. The next morning, Rachel's phone started buzzing with notifications. Local animal rights groups had picked up the story and were reaching out to offer their support. The Positive Justice Initiative, a well-known advocacy group, sent an email offering free legal consultation and public relations assistance. "Mom! Mom!" ! Max called out, running into the kitchen with his laptop. "Look at these numbers! Thousands of people are talking about Ruby now." Rachel scrolled through the messages, her heart swelling with gratitude. People were sharing their own stories of pets with medical conditions, offering words of encouragement, and even volunteering to help with Ruby's medical expenses. The Positive Justice Initiative's representative, Sarah Chen, called Rachel directly. "We've seen Ruby's story," she said warmly. "We'd like to help you fight this. Our legal team has experience with similar cases." Max bounced on his toes as Rachel spoke on the phone. When she hung up, he could barely contain his excitement. "What did they say? Can they help Ruby?" Rachel pulled him into a tight hug. "They're going to try, honey. You've done something amazing here." The following morning, Rachel woke up to her phone practically exploding with notifications. Ruby's story had been picked up by several major news outlets overnight. Max's campaign had gone viral, with tens of thousands of shares and a growing community of supporters. Max burst into her room, still in his pajamas. "Mom, we're trending. People everywhere are talking about Ruby." His face glowed with pride and achievement. But as Rachel scrolled through the flood of messages and news articles, she felt her stomach tighten. Their private struggle had become a public spectacle. Local news vans were already parked outside their house, and reporters were requesting interviews. She looked at Max's beaming face, so proud of what he'd accomplished, and managed a smile. But inside, she felt the weight of all those eyes watching them, all those people invested in Ruby's fate. The pressure to save their beloved dog had never felt more intense. The camera flashes were blinding as Rachel and Max emerged from Dr. Avery's clinic. Reporters crowded around them, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Mrs. Parker, what do you say to those who think Ruby is a threat to public safety?" one reporter shouted. "Is it true Ruby has a brain condition?" called another. Rachel pulled Max closer to her side, shielding him from the press of bodies. "No comment," she said firmly, guiding them toward their car. Dr. Avery appeared at the clinic door, his presence creating a momentary distraction that allowed them to slip away. In the car, Max scrolled through his phone, showing his mother the latest news coverage. "Look, Mom! We made the national news!" His excitement contrasted sharply with Rachel's growing unease. At home, Rachel watched the evening news with a mixture of hope and dread. Some stations portrayed Ruby sympathetically, featuring experts who discussed canine cognitive disorders and the importance of proper medical diagnosis. Others took a more sensational approach, repeatedly showing the graphic details of the attack and interviewing people who demanded Ruby's immediate euthanasia. "That dog is a ticking time bomb," one angry neighbor declared on screen. "What if it had been a child instead of another dog?" Rachel's phone buzzed constantly with messages from strangers. Some offered prayers and support, while others sent hostile messages blaming her for putting the community at risk. She found herself checking over her shoulder whenever she left the house, worried about who might be watching or filming. The pressure became overwhelming. Rachel struggled to focus at work, where customers now recognized her and wanted to discuss Ruby's case. Some left generous tips with encouraging notes, while others made a point of telling her they thought Ruby should be put down. Max, however, seemed to thrive on the attention. He continued updating his social media campaign, responding to supporters, and sharing new information about Ruby's condition. His determination never wavered, even when classmates at school repeated their parents' negative opinions. Late that night, Rachel sat in the living room, watching Max organize another online rally for Ruby. He had spread his laptop, notebook, and Ruby's photos across the coffee table, working with intense concentration. "We're getting so much support, Mom," he said, looking up with bright eyes. "People really want to help Ruby. We can't give up now." Rachel reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "We won't give up, sweetie. We're doing the right thing," she assured him, even as doubt gnawed at her insides. She wondered if they were doing enough, if there was something more they could do to save Ruby. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, making her question every decision, every move they made in this very public fight for their dog's life. The courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade casting long shadows in the morning light. Rachel's hands trembled as she straightened Max's tie. They climbed the steps together, passing through security and making their way to the designated courtroom. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. Reporters filled the back rows, their notebooks ready. Rachel and Max took their seats at the defense table, where their lawyer waited with a reassuring smile. The prosecutor, Mr. Harrison, stood tall and imposing in his crisp suit. His opening statement cut through the air like a knife. "This is a clear-cut case of a dangerous animal that poses an immediate threat to public safety," he declared, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. "The evidence will show that this dog, unprovoked, viciously attacked and killed another animal." As witnesses took the stand one by one, Rachel's stomach churned. The owner of the deceased dog spoke through tears, describing the attack in vivid detail. The animal control officer testified about Ruby's aggressive behavior during capture. Max grabbed his mother's hand, squeezing it tight. When Dr. Avery took the stand, his familiar presence brought a small measure of comfort. He spoke clearly and professionally, explaining Ruby's symptoms and the test results that suggested a neurological condition. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Avery stated, "Ruby's behavior is consistent with canine cognitive dysfunction syndrome, or a similar neurological disorder. This condition can cause confusion, anxiety, and unexpected aggression in otherwise gentle dogs." Mr. Harrison paced before the witness stand, his expression skeptical. "Doctor? Avery, isn't it true that aggressive behavior is often the result of poor training or negligent ownership?" "That can be true in some cases, Doctor," Avery replied calmly. "But Ruby's history shows no prior incidents of aggression. The sudden onset of these symptoms strongly suggests a medical cause." "And yet you can't definitively prove this diagnosis, can you?" Harrison pressed. "Medicine isn't always about absolute certainty," Dr. Avery responded, maintaining his composure. "It's about identifying patterns and symptoms, then treating them appropriately." The questioning continued, growing more intense with each exchange. Harrison tried to paint Dr. Avery as inexperienced in behavioral cases, but the veterinarian's decades of experience spoke for themselves. By the end of the day, Rachel felt drained. Her shoulders slumped as she gathered her belongings, the weight of the trial pressing down on her. "Mom," Max whispered, touching her arm. "Doctor, Avery did great today. Remember what you always tell me? We have to keep trying, no matter what." Rachel managed a small smile, drawing strength from her son's unwavering faith. They had done everything they could for today, but the trial wasn't over yet. The hashtag number sign, Save Ruby, trended nationwide as Max's social media campaign continued to gain momentum. Celebrity pet advocates shared his posts and animal welfare organizations picked up the story. The local news stations ran segments showing Ruby's gentle past, clips of her playing with Max in the backyard, helping Rachel bring in groceries, and sleeping peacefully on the family couch. But not everyone supported their cause. Comment sections filled with heated debates. Some people posted angry messages about public safety, while others shared stories of their own pets who had been helped by proper medical diagnosis and treatment. "Look at this, Mom," Max called from the living room computer. "Another 1,000 people signed the petition." His eyes sparkled with hope as he scrolled through the latest signatures. Rachel leaned over his shoulder, her heart warming at the outpouring of support. Yet she couldn't help noticing the opposing comments too. People calling for Ruby's immediate euthanasia, claiming no dog with a history of violence should be given another chance. The phone rang, cutting through her worried thoughts. Rachel answered, expecting another reporter seeking comment. "Hello, is this Rachel Parker?" The voice was confident and professional. "I'm Lisa Mendez, an animal rights attorney. I've been following Ruby's case closely through your son's campaign." Rachel sat down at the kitchen table, her hand tightening on the phone. "Yes, this is Rachel. I specialize in cases like Ruby's," Lisa continued. "I've helped several families prove their pets weren't inherently dangerous, but were suffering from medical conditions. I'd like to offer my services pro bono." "Pro bono?" Rachel's voice wavered. "You mean free of charge?" "Exactly. Your case resonates with me personally. My own dog was almost euthanized years ago due to behavior changes caused by a brain tumor. With proper medical care, he lived another 5 happy years. They spoke for nearly an hour, with Lisa outlining her experience and suggesting new legal strategies. She explained how they could better present the medical evidence and challenge the prosecution's arguments about public safety. We can file a motion to have Ruby thoroughly evaluated by an independent veterinary neurologist, Lisa explained. And we'll emphasize the correlation Dr. Avery found between her past medical issues and behavioral incidents. That evening, Rachel watched Max update their online supporters about Lisa joining their team. Comments poured in immediately, messages of hope, virtual hugs, and promises to attend the next court session in support of Ruby. Rachel felt tears well up in her eyes as she read through the messages. Each word of encouragement, each shared story of hope, lifted a little bit of the weight from her shoulders. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like they had a real fighting chance. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves about the upcoming court sessions. The road ahead would still be difficult, but they weren't walking it alone anymore. They had Lisa's legal expertise, Doctor, Avery's medical knowledge, and thousands of supporters standing behind them. The courtroom fell silent as Rachel took the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them in her lap, but her voice remained steady as she began to speak about Ruby. Ruby came into our lives when Max was only 6, Rachel explained, her eyes meeting the judge's. She was this tiny ball of fur at the shelter, and the moment we saw her, we knew she belonged with us. Rachel described their daily life with Ruby, how the German Shepherd would wait patiently by Max's bed each morning to wake him up, how she'd carry her own leash to the door for walks, and how she'd curl up next to them during movie nights. She's more than just a pet, Rachel continued, her voice growing thick with emotion. Ruby is family. She's been there through everything, through the divorce, through Max's struggles at school, through all our ups and downs. As she spoke about Ruby's recent changes, Rachel's composure began to crack. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her voice quivered. It was like watching a different dog entirely. The Ruby I know would never deliberately hurt anyone. She's always been so gentle, so loving. Rachel wiped at her eyes with a tissue. The day of the incident, I saw the confusion in her eyes. She looked lost, scared. That's when I knew something was wrong. The Ruby we know and love was trapped inside a mind that wasn't working right. Her shoulders shook as she tried to contain her emotions. Please, she pleaded with the judge, Ruby doesn't deserve to die because of an illness she can't control. She needs treatment, not punishment. From his seat in the gallery, Max watched his mother break down on the stand. His face reddened with emotion, and before anyone could stop him, he stood up. Your Honor, Max called out, his young voice clear and strong, can I please say something about Ruby? The judge, surprised by the interruption, considered for a moment before nodding. Come forward, young man. Max walked to the front of the courtroom, his sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. Though his hands were shaking, his chin was held high. Last year, when I was being bullied at school, Ruby knew something was wrong before anyone else did, Max began. This older kid had been following me home, saying mean things. One day, he tried to push me down, but Ruby was there. She didn't attack him. She just stood between us, calm but firm, until he backed away. Max's voice grew stronger as he continued. That's who Ruby really is. She protects people. She doesn't hurt them. She's my best friend, and I know she's sick right now, but that doesn't make her bad. The courtroom remained completely still as the 10-year-old spoke. Several jurors dabbed at their eyes, moved by his earnest testimony. Even the bailiff seemed affected, clearing his throat and looking away. Please don't take Ruby away from us, Max finished, his voice catching slightly. She deserves a chance to get better. The prosecutor stood up immediately after Max's testimony, a stern expression on his face. He called his next witness, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a nationally recognized animal behaviorist with 20 years of experience. Dr. Mitchell adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses as she took the stand. In my professional opinion, Ruby's aggressive behavior stems from inadequate training and an inherently unstable temperament, she stated firmly. The attack wasn't an isolated incident caused by illness. It was the culmination of escalating warning signs. The prosecutor paced slowly before the witness stand. Could you elaborate on these warning signs, Doctor? Mitchell? Certainly. The previous incident where Ruby snapped at a stranger is particularly telling. Well-trained, stable dogs don't typically exhibit such behavior, even when stressed or ill. Dr. Mitchell's voice carried authority as she continued. Furthermore, the level of aggression displayed in the recent attack suggests deep-rooted behavioral issues, not merely confusion from a medical condition. Rachel's stomach tightened as she watched Dr. Mitchell present charts and statistics about dog attacks. The expert's confident demeanor seemed to sway several jurors. Dr. Avery took the stand next, his familiar calm presence a stark contrast to Dr. Mitchell's clinical detachment. He pulled out Ruby's medical records and brain scans. These tests show clear indicators of canine cognitive dysfunction syndrome, Dr. Avery explained, pointing to specific areas on the scans. The condition affects the brain similarly to Alzheimer's in humans. It can cause severe confusion, anxiety, and yes, unexpected aggression. The prosecutor's questions grew more pointed. But Dr. Avery, isn't it true that many dogs with this condition never show aggressive behavior? Every case is different, Dr. Avery replied steadily. What we're seeing in Ruby's case is a textbook example of CCDS-related aggression. The sudden onset, the confusion afterward, the lack of any previous violent incidents, it all points to a medical cause, not a behavioral one. The two experts continued to clash, their testimonies creating a tense atmosphere in the courtroom. Dr. Mitchell insisted that medical treatment wouldn't guarantee public safety, while Dr. Avery argued that Ruby's condition was treatable and manageable. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, Rachel felt her confidence wavering. Dr. Mitchell's testimony had been compelling, and she could see how it had affected the jury. What if they're right? Rachel whispered to Dr. Avery as they walked down the courthouse steps. What if we're wrong about all of this? Dr. Avery placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Rachel, I've known Ruby since she was a puppy. This isn't about being right or wrong. It's about fighting for a dog who deserves a chance at treatment. We have to stay strong for her. Rachel nodded, trying to draw strength from his words, but the weight of uncertainty still pressed heavily on her shoulders as they headed home. Dr. Avery stood in the veterinary clinic's examination room, his eyes fixed intently on the latest brain scans displayed on the light box. The neurologist, Dr. Chen, pointed to a small dark spot on the image. There, Dr. Chen said, tapping the screen. The lesion is small, but it's in an area that could definitely affect behavior and emotional regulation. Dr. Avery leaned closer, his heart racing with the significance of their discovery. They had conducted these final tests almost as a last resort, using more advanced imaging technology than their previous scans. Ruby lay sleeping peacefully in the corner of the room, still under the effects of the sedation required for the imaging. This changes everything, Dr. Avery said quietly. He picked up his phone to call Rachel. 20 minutes later, Rachel rushed into the clinic with Max close behind. Her face was flushed from hurrying, and her eyes were wide with anticipation. "What did you find?" she asked breathlessly. Dr. Avery guided them to his office, where the scans were now displayed. He pointed to the lesion, explaining in simple terms what they had discovered. "See this dark spot here? It's a lesion, basically damaged tissue in Ruby's brain. We missed it in earlier scans because it's quite small, but its location is crucial. This area of the brain helps control behavior and emotional responses." Rachel leaned forward, studying the image. "So this could explain why she attacked that other dog?" "Exactly," Dr. Avery nodded. "Brain lesions like this can cause sudden personality changes, confusion, and aggressive behavior. It's like having a short circuit in the brain's warning system. Ruby literally couldn't control her actions during these episodes." Max moved closer to the screen, his young face serious. "Can it be fixed?" "There are treatment options," Dr. Avery explained. "The important thing is that we now have concrete proof that Ruby's aggression stems from a medical condition, not from her personality or training." He pulled out some papers from his desk. "I've already started preparing the documentation for the court. This evidence directly links Ruby's behavior to a physical cause, something we can point to and say, 'This is why it happened.'" Rachel sank into a chair, relief washing over her face. "Do you think this will be enough?" "It's the strongest evidence we've had so far," Dr. Avery replied. "It supports everything we've been saying about Ruby's condition being medical rather than behavioral." After gathering all the necessary documentation, Dr. Avery personally delivered the new evidence to the courthouse. Rachel and Max watched him walk up the courthouse steps, the manila envelope containing their hopes for Ruby's future tucked securely under his arm. On their drive home, Rachel felt lighter than she had in weeks. Max chatted excitedly from the passenger seat about Ruby coming home soon. The late afternoon sun streamed through the car windows, warming them as they pulled into their driveway. Inside their house, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, the weight of possibility settling around her. The medical evidence they now had felt like a lifeline, something solid to hold on to after weeks of uncertainty. Max sat beside her, holding her hand, both of them quietly hoping this would be enough to save Ruby. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters holding signs that read, "Save Ruby," and "Medical condition, not aggression." News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Rachel watched the growing crowd from inside her car, amazed at how many people had shown up to support Ruby. "Look, Mom!" Max pointed to a group of children about his age. They wore T-shirts with Ruby's picture and the words "Second Chance for Ruby" printed across them. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The prosecutor's confident demeanor had given way to uncertainty as he shuffled through his papers. The judge leaned forward in his chair, studying the new medical evidence with careful attention. Dr. Avery's testimony about the brain lesion commanded the room. He explained the significance of their discovery in clear, simple terms that everyone could understand. "This lesion," he said, pointing to the enlarged scan, "is like a broken switch in Ruby's brain. It can cause her to act in ways that aren't truly her." The local news coverage that evening focused on the medical breakthrough. "In a surprising turn of events," the anchor reported, "new evidence suggests that Ruby, the German Shepherd facing euthanasia, may be suffering from a treatable medical condition." Social media exploded with support. Save Ruby trended locally, then nationally. Pet owners shared stories of their own dogs' medical conditions and successful treatments. Veterinarians from around the country weighed in, supporting Dr. Avery's findings. Even those who had initially demanded Ruby's euthanasia began to change their minds. The mother of the dog Ruby had attacked posted a heartfelt message online. "While we still grieve for our pet, we understand now that Ruby was sick. No one should be punished for being ill." That evening, Rachel and Max sat on their living room couch, watching the news coverage. The TV showed clips of the growing crowd outside the courthouse, interviews with supporters, and experts discussing Ruby's condition. "Look at all these people fighting for Ruby," Max said, his eyes glued to the screen. He turned to his mother, his face full of determination. "We're not going to give up, Mom. Not now, not ever. We'll keep fighting until Ruby gets her second chance." Rachel pulled her son close, both of them drawing strength from the outpouring of support they were witnessing. The news anchor's voice continued in the background, describing how public opinion had shifted dramatically since the revelation of Ruby's medical condition. Rachel lay in her darkened bedroom, staring at the ceiling as moonlight filtered through the curtains. Her mind raced with memories of Ruby as a puppy, playing in the backyard, cuddling with Max during thunderstorms, and being the gentle guardian she'd always known. But now, those happy memories were clouded by doubt. "If only I'd noticed something was wrong sooner," she whispered to herself, rolling onto her side. Her pillow was damp with tears she hadn't realized she'd been crying. Every moment with Ruby replayed in her mind like a movie, and she searched desperately for signs she might have missed. Had there been subtle changes in Ruby's behavior? Little hints that something wasn't quite right. The weight of these questions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She thought about all the time she'd taken Ruby to Dr. Avery for routine checkups. Should she have asked for more tests? Should she have been more vigilant? The sudden ring of her phone startled her. Dr. Avery's name lit up the screen. "Rachel." His voice was gentle, concerned. "I had a feeling you might be awake." "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted, her voice trembling. "If I'd noticed something earlier, maybe none of this would have happened." "Listen to me," Dr. Avery said firmly but kindly. "You've been one of the most attentive pet owners I've ever known. Ruby's condition was difficult to diagnose, even with advanced testing. There's no way you could have known." Rachel clutched the phone tighter, drawing comfort from his words. "What we've discovered here," he continued, "what you fought for, it's going to help other dogs and their families. Because of you and Ruby, veterinarians will know to look for these signs. You've made a real difference." His words settled over her like a warm blanket. She thought about all the messages they'd received from other pet owners sharing similar stories, thanking them for bringing attention to this condition. After hanging up, Rachel walked to her window and looked out at the quiet street. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of court appearances, medical tests, and public attention. But through it all, one thing remained constant: her love for Ruby. She remembered the first day she'd brought Ruby home from the shelter, how the scared puppy had quickly become the heart of their family. Their bond went beyond simple pet ownership. Ruby was family. And families stuck together through good times and bad. Rachel touched the window pane, watching her breath fog the glass. Dr. Avery was right. Even if things didn't go their way in court, they'd accomplished something important. They'd shown that there was more to behavioral issues than met the eye, that sometimes what looked like aggression was actually a cry for help. She felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever happened in the coming days, she knew they'd fought the good fight. They'd stood up for what they believed in, and they'd helped shine a light on a condition that might have gone unnoticed in other dogs. Tomorrow would bring another day in court, another chance to fight for Ruby. But for now, Rachel felt the crushing weight of self-doubt begin to lift. She had done everything she could, and she would continue to do so until the very end. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Lisa Mendez rose from her seat. Her steps were measured and confident as she approached the bench. Rachel watched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the lawyer began her final argument. "Your Honor," Lisa started, her voice clear and strong, "we stand here today not just to decide the fate of a dog, but to acknowledge a profound medical truth that has come to light. The evidence presented by Dr. Avery shows conclusively that Ruby suffers from a brain lesion, a physical condition that directly influenced her behavior. Lisa gestured toward the medical charts displayed on the courtroom screen. These scans tell the story of a dog who isn't naturally aggressive, but rather one who needs medical care. Ruby has been a loving, gentle companion to the Parker family for years. One incident, tragic as it was, shouldn't erase that history, especially when we now understand its medical cause. Rachel watched as the judge studied the brain scans, his expression thoughtful. Lisa continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone. To sentence Ruby to death would not serve justice. It would only compound this tragedy. With proper medical treatment, Ruby can return to being the gentle, loving dog she's always been. The prosecutor stood next, straightening his tie. Your Honor, while the defense's argument is emotionally compelling, we cannot ignore the facts. A dog died because of Ruby's actions. Medical condition or not, she poses a clear danger to the community. We cannot risk another incident. He paced before the bench, his voice growing harder. What happens if the treatment fails? What happens if Ruby attacks again? The safety of our community must come first. Euthanasia is the only responsible choice. Rachel felt her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced at Max, who sat rigid beside her, his face pale but determined. Dr. Avery, seated behind them, leaned forward slightly, his expression tense. The prosecutor's words seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. We cannot gamble with public safety based on medical theories and emotional appeals. The law is clear about dangerous dogs, regardless of the circumstances. As the final arguments concluded, Rachel and Max found a quiet corner in the courthouse hallway. The marble walls felt cold and imposing around them, but Max's presence brought warmth to the moment. Mom, Max said softly, taking her hand. Whatever happens today, we did everything we could for Ruby. We showed everyone who she really is. Rachel squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. We did, didn't we? She looked at her son's brave face, seeing wisdom beyond his years. Ruby is so lucky to have you fighting for her. We're all fighting for her, Max replied. And even if... His voice caught slightly. Even if things don't go our way, we showed people that dogs like Ruby deserve a chance. That they're not just being bad. Sometimes they're sick and need help. Rachel pulled Max into a tight hug, drawing strength from his unwavering spirit. In that quiet moment, before the judge would make his final decision, she felt immensely proud of how far they'd come, not just in fighting for Ruby, but in showing the world her true nature. The afternoon sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Rachel sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, Max fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, occasionally glancing at his mother with worried eyes. Dr. Avery and Lisa sat nearby, their expressions equally tense as they waited for Judge Harrison's return. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers or clearing of throats. Rachel's mind raced through every moment of the trial, Dr. Avery's testimony, the medical evidence, Max's heartfelt words, and Lisa's passionate defense. It all came down to this moment. The bailiff's voice cut through the quiet. All rise. The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. Everyone stood as Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, his black robe swishing softly as he took his place at the bench. His face remained neutral as he settled into his chair and adjusted his reading glasses. Please be seated, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. After careful consideration of all evidence presented in this case, I am ready to deliver my ruling. Judge Harrison paused, looking over his notes before continuing. The attack that brought us here today was indeed tragic. The loss of life is never to be taken lightly, and this court has a responsibility to ensure public safety." Rachel felt her heart sink at these words, but the judge wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "the evidence presented by Dr. Avery and the defense team clearly shows that Ruby's condition was overlooked during the initial investigation. The medical documentation, particularly the brain scans showing the lesion, provides compelling evidence that Ruby's actions were not the result of an inherently aggressive nature or poor training." The judge removed his glasses, his expression softening slightly. "It is this court's belief that Ruby's behavior was directly influenced by an undiagnosed medical condition. To ignore this evidence would be to deny the advances in veterinary medicine and our understanding of animal behavior." Rachel felt Mac's hand slip into hers as they waited for the final verdict. "Therefore," Judge Harrison announced, "it is the decision of this court that Ruby will not be euthanized." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Rachel's free hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "However," the judge continued, raising his voice slightly to maintain order, "this second chance comes with strict conditions. Ruby must undergo a comprehensive treatment program for her condition, along with regular behavioral monitoring. She will need to be evaluated by qualified professionals on a regular basis to ensure both her health and the safety of the community." Relief flooded through Rachel's body as she pulled Max into a tight embrace. Around them, the courtroom buzzed with murmured conversations. Dr. Avery smiled broadly, while Lisa gathered her papers with satisfied nods.
Ruby would live. She would come home.
The late afternoon light spilled across the driveway as Rachel opened the car door, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and apprehension. Ruby stepped out cautiously, her paws touching the familiar concrete. The German shepherd's ears perked up at the sight of their home, but her movements remained slower than before, more deliberate. "Welcome home, girl," Rachel whispered, gently guiding Ruby with her leash. Max could barely contain his excitement, bouncing on his toes as they approached the front door. "Can I pet her now, Mom?" "Please?" Rachel nodded, but kept her hand firmly on the leash. "Gentle, remember what Dr. Avery said." Max knelt beside Ruby, who nuzzled his hand with familiar affection. The boy's face lit up with pure joy as he scratched behind her ears. "See, Mom? She's still our Ruby." Rachel watched them carefully, noting every movement, every reaction. Though Ruby seemed calm, there was still uncertainty in her eyes, as if she wasn't quite sure of her surroundings. The familiar setting appeared to help, but Rachel could tell Ruby wasn't entirely herself yet. The next morning, Dr. Avery arrived early with a thick folder and a bag of medications. He sat at their kitchen table, explaining each aspect of Ruby's treatment plan, while Rachel took careful notes. "The medication will help manage her symptoms," he explained, laying out several bottles. "But the cognitive therapy is just as important. We'll need to establish routines, use memory exercises, and maintain consistent behavioral training." Rachel studied the schedule he'd created. "It seems like a lot," she admitted. "It is, Doctor." Avery agreed, his kind eyes meeting hers. "But you're not alone in this. I'll be here every step of the way." Over the next few weeks, Ruby's progress was slow but steady. Some days were better than others. The medication helped reduce her confusion, though she still had moments where she seemed lost in her own home. Max devoted himself to Ruby's therapy exercises, turning them into games they could play together. "Look, Mom!" Max called out one afternoon, holding up a puzzle toy. "Ruby found the treat in under a minute today. That's her best time yet." Rachel smiled, watching as Ruby gently took another treat from Max's hand. The dog's tail wagged steadily, a sight that filled Rachel's heart with hope. Though Ruby might never be exactly as she was before, these small victories meant everything. That evening, Rachel sat on the back porch, watching Max and Ruby in the yard. The setting sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges as Max tossed Ruby's favorite ball. Not too far, just as Dr. Avery had instructed. Ruby followed the ball with her eyes, moving at her own pace to retrieve it. The scene before her brought tears to Rachel's eyes. They had come so close to losing all of this. The simple joy of watching her son play with his beloved dog, the peaceful evenings in their backyard, the unconditional love that Ruby brought to their lives. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with medication schedules, therapy sessions, and constant monitoring. But as Rachel watched Max praise Ruby for bringing back the ball, she knew that every effort would be worth it. Weeks passed like gentle waves, each one bringing small but noticeable improvements in Ruby's condition. The German Shepherd's eyes grew clearer, more focused, and her movements became steadier. During their morning walks, she no longer startled at familiar sounds or showed signs of confusion about their regular route. Dr. Avery visited twice a week, his clipboard filled with detailed notes about Ruby's progress. Her response to the medication has been remarkable, he said during one checkup, watching Ruby follow Max's simple commands. The cognitive exercises are clearly helping too. Rachel noticed the change in their home's atmosphere. The tension that had gripped them during the trial and early recovery period had lifted, replaced by a calm they hadn't felt in months. Max's shoulders relaxed when he played with Ruby, no longer watching her every move with worried eyes. Word of Ruby's recovery spread through their small community. The local animal shelter, where Rachel had first found Ruby, invited them to speak at their monthly adoption event. Rachel stood before a small crowd, her voice steady as she shared their story. "We almost lost her because we didn't know what was wrong," Rachel explained to the attentive audience. "But thanks to Dr. Avery and proper medical care, we discovered the real cause of her behavior changes." Max joined these events too, proudly showing pictures of Ruby and explaining to other kids how they helped with her recovery. "Sometimes dogs get sick in ways we can't see," he told them, "but that doesn't mean they're bad dogs." Their story resonated with other pet owners. People began approaching them at the grocery store or park, sharing similar experiences with their own pets. Some had noticed behavioral changes in their dogs, but hadn't considered medical causes. Rachel found herself becoming an unofficial resource, directing worried pet owners to Dr. Avery and other specialists. The family's advocacy work expanded to other shelters in neighboring towns. They created informational packets about canine cognitive disorders and the importance of thorough medical evaluations. Ruby, now calmer and more stable, became a living example of how proper diagnosis and treatment could change a dog's life. One peaceful evening, Rachel, Max, and Ruby sat in their backyard. The setting sun painted the sky in soft colors, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Ruby lay contentedly between them, her head resting on Max's lap while he gently stroked her fur. Rachel watched them, remembering the desperate days when she thought she might lose Ruby forever. The court battle, the sleepless nights, the fear. It all seemed like a distant storm that had finally passed. Now, with each passing day, Ruby showed more and more signs of returning to her old self. Her eyes held that familiar warmth again, and her gentle nature had resurfaced. "She's really better now, isn't she, Mom?" Max asked softly, scratching behind Ruby's ears. Rachel nodded, her heart full as she watched Ruby's tail wag lazily in response to Max's attention. Their family felt whole again, stronger for having weathered the storm together. The fight for Ruby's second chance had transformed them all, teaching them about persistence, hope, and the power of unconditional love. The local animal shelter buzzed with excitement as Rachel, Max, and Ruby made their way through the entrance. Colorful adoption posters lined the walls, and the sound of happy barks filled the air. Ruby walked calmly beside them, her demeanor a far cry from the confused and agitated dog she had been months ago. "We're so glad you could make it," Sarah, the shelter manager, greeted them warmly. "The attendees are really looking forward to hearing Ruby's story." Rachel stood at the front of the room, with Ruby sitting obediently beside her. Max beamed with pride as his mother began to speak. The crowd of potential adopters and animal lovers listened intently as Rachel shared their journey. "There was a time when we almost lost hope," Rachel explained, her voice steady but emotional. "But thanks to proper medical care and understanding, Ruby got her second chance." She detailed the symptoms they had noticed, the diagnosis process, and the treatment that had helped Ruby recover. The audience watched in amazement as Ruby demonstrated her gentle nature, accepting pets from children and responding to Max's commands with ease. Several people wiped away tears as Rachel described the court battle and their fight to save Ruby's life. During the question and answer session, a couple made their way through the crowd to speak with Rachel. The woman wrung her hands nervously as she explained their situation. "Our dog has started showing signs of aggression," she said, her voice trembling. "We're scared and don't know what to do. Your story gives us hope." Max stepped forward, his experience evident in his confident response. "The first thing we learned was not to give up," he said. "Sometimes dogs act differently because they're sick, just like people do." Rachel nodded, adding, "The key is getting a thorough medical evaluation. We can give you Dr. Avery's contact information. He's wonderful with cases like this." The couple listened eagerly as Rachel and Max shared their knowledge about behavioral changes, medical evaluations, and the importance of patience during treatment. Other attendees gathered around, taking notes and asking questions about their own pets' behaviors. As the event wound down, Rachel, Max, and Ruby began their walk home through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood. The autumn air was crisp, and Ruby trotted contentedly between them, her tail wagging gently. "Did you see how many people wanted to learn about Ruby's story?" Max asked, his face glowing with satisfaction. Rachel watched as neighbors waved and smiled at Ruby, the same dog they had once feared. Children called out happy greetings, and passing cars slowed down so their occupants could wave at the now famous local dog. "We're really making a difference," Rachel said softly, reaching down to pat Ruby's head. "People are starting to understand that there's often more to the story when animals act out." The community's shift in perspective was evident in the warm greetings they received. Ruby had become more than just a family pet. She was living proof that with proper medical care and understanding, dogs deserved second chances. The autumn morning started like any other at the local park. Ruby trotted alongside Rachel and Max, her leash loose as she calmly observed the world around her. Children played on the swings, and joggers passed by with friendly waves. Everything seemed perfect until a man suddenly darted around the corner, moving quickly toward them. Ruby's body tensed. Before Rachel could react, Ruby let out a sharp bark and lunged forward, snapping at the air near the stranger. The man jumped back, startled but unharmed. Rachel's hands shook as she pulled Ruby close, apologizing profusely. Max's face went pale. "Mom?" His voice trembled with worry. Rachel's mind raced with horrible possibilities. Would animal control come back? Would they have to go through another trial? The fear she thought she'd left behind came rushing back. Dr. Avery's office was quiet when they rushed in later that day. He listened carefully to Rachel's description of the incident, nodding thoughtfully as she spoke. "This doesn't mean we're back to square one," Dr. Avery assured them, his voice calm and steady. Setbacks are a normal part of recovery. Think of it like physical therapy. Some days are better than others. Max sat close to Ruby, his hand resting on her fur. So, she's not getting worse? No, Dr. Avery smiled gently. But we'll need to adjust her medication and perhaps intensify her therapy sessions for a while. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and Max devoted themselves to Ruby's adjusted treatment plan. They attended extra therapy sessions where Ruby learned to remain calm around sudden movements. Dr. Avery modified her medication dosage, carefully monitoring her response to the changes. The routine became more structured. Rachel set specific times for walks, choosing quieter paths and less crowded areas. Max helped with Ruby's cognitive exercises, playing games that kept her mind active and focused. They worked as a team, supporting Ruby through each step of her recovery. Gradually, Ruby's stability returned. Her eyes became clearer, her responses more measured. While walking through their neighborhood, she remained calm even when surprised by unexpected noises or movements. Still, Rachel kept a watchful eye, always aware that recovery wasn't a straight line, but a winding path that required patience and understanding. One peaceful evening, as Rachel watched Ruby sleeping peacefully in her bed, she realized that the setback had taught them all something valuable. While hope remained strong in their hearts, they had learned to balance it with careful attention to Ruby's needs and limitations. The journey wasn't over, but they were better equipped to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees as Rachel, Max, and Ruby walked along their favorite trail. The morning sun cast dappled shadows on the path, and Ruby's tail wagged contentedly as she padded alongside them. It had been exactly 1 year since the judge's ruling that changed their lives. Rachel watched as Ruby stopped to sniff a cluster of wildflowers, her movements calm and deliberate. The German shepherd's eyes were clear and bright, showing none of the confusion that had once clouded them. The medication and therapy had worked wonders, transforming Ruby back into the gentle companion they had always known her to be. "Look, Mom," Max whispered, pointing to a butterfly that had landed near Ruby's nose. The dog simply watched it with mild curiosity, her body relaxed and at ease. Rachel smiled, remembering a time when such unexpected movements might have triggered an aggressive response. As they rounded the corner of the trail, they encountered Mrs. Henderson, their neighbor, who had once been one of the loudest voices calling for Ruby's removal from the neighborhood. The woman stopped in her tracks, clearly surprised by the sight before her. "I can hardly believe this is the same dog," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes wide with wonder. Ruby sat calmly at Rachel's feet, showing no signs of distress. "I have to admit, I was wrong about her. What you've done, it's really quite remarkable." Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes as Mrs. Henderson reached down to pat Ruby's head. The dog leaned into the touch, tail wagging gently. "Thank you for saying that," Rachel replied softly. "It means a lot to us." "You've shown us all something important," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Sometimes what looks like aggression is really just a cry for help. I've been telling everyone about Ruby's story." Max beamed with pride as he scratched behind Ruby's ears. The transformation in the community's attitude had been gradual but profound. Where once there had been fear and suspicion, now there was understanding and support. Later that evening, Rachel, Max, and Ruby settled into their living room. Ruby curled up in her plush bed near the fireplace, her breathing deep and peaceful. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated her serene face, and Rachel marveled at how far they had come. Max sat cross-legged on the floor next to Ruby's bed, gently stroking her fur. "We did it, Mom," he said quietly. "We really did it." Rachel nodded, watching her son and their beloved dog together. The journey had changed them all, teaching them lessons about perseverance, hope, and the power of second chances. Through their advocacy, they had helped other families understand the importance of looking beyond behavior to find underlying causes. And Ruby had become a symbol of hope for misunderstood dogs everywhere. Max sat on the back porch steps, his lanky teenage frame hunched forward as he watched Ruby chase butterflies in the garden. The German Shepherd's gray muzzle showed her age now, but her eyes still sparkled with joy as she bounded through the flowers Rachel had planted last spring. Rachel joined her son, passing him a glass of lemonade as she settled beside him. "Remember when we thought we might lose her?" Max asked, his voice carrying the weight of memories. "Those were some of the darkest days," Rachel replied, watching Ruby roll contentedly in a patch of grass. "The trial seems like another lifetime ago now." Max nodded, remembering the crowded courtroom, the tension in the air, and the fear that had gripped his heart. "I was so scared," he admitted. "But starting that social media campaign, it felt like I had to do something." Rachel wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders. "You were braver than anyone, sweetheart. Your voice helped people understand Ruby's story." Their relationship had deepened through the ordeal. What started as a fight to save their dog had transformed them into a stronger family unit. Rachel now spent her weekends at the local animal shelter, sharing Ruby's story with families considering adoption. She helped them understand that behavioral issues weren't always what they seemed, that sometimes animals needed medical help just like people did. "Mrs. Thompson from the shelter called yesterday," Rachel said. "They've started implementing that new screening program we talked about. Every dog showing signs of aggression will get a full medical workup before any decisions are made." Max smiled, remembering how different things had been when Ruby first showed signs of aggression. "We changed things, didn't we, Mom?" "We did, honey. We really did." Ruby trotted over to them, her tail wagging as she settled at their feet. The evening sun cast a warm glow over their backyard, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Max reached down to scratch behind Ruby's ears, exactly where she liked it best. Rachel watched her son and their dog together, her heart full of gratitude. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been tears, sleepless nights, and moments of doubt. But sitting here now, watching Ruby lean into Max's touch with complete trust and contentment, she knew every challenge had been worth it. "Come on," Rachel said, standing up. "Let's head inside. It's getting chilly." They settled in their living room, Ruby curling up in her favorite spot by the fireplace. Max sat on the floor beside her, while Rachel took her usual place on the couch. The room felt peaceful, filled with the kind of quiet contentment that comes from being exactly where you're meant to be. Ruby let out a contented sigh, her eyes half closed as she basked in the warmth of both the fire and her family's presence. Rachel looked at her beloved dog, remembering the scared, confused animal she had been during her illness. Now, Ruby was the picture of serenity, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and understood. If you enjoyed the story of Rachel and Ruby, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.